Hey guys, imagine if you found out that one of your favourite horror movies was based on a true story, and in finding this out, you find yourself participating in its sequel/spin-off. Well, that was the premise that the 1985 fantasy horror movie Return of the Living Dead had to offer. Directed by legendary writer Dan O'Bannon, Return of the Living Dead tells the story of Freddy. Nope, not that Freddy. Not that one either. This guy, who is the new employee of a medical supply warehouse company, where his older co-worker Frank shows him top secret barrels which contain a toxic gas, and explains that those barrels are what caused the real life events of the movie Night of the Living Dead. But lo and behold, because Frank is not very smart, one barrel whack later and the toxic gas is released, which once again causes the dead to come back to life with a taste of human brains, in this well-loved cult classic, which acts as a love letter to the zombie subgenre, with extra dashes of comedy thrown in for good measure. So today we are going to explore this part loving homage and part sequel to Night of the Living Dead by looking into 10 things that you may not know about Return of the Living Dead. The zombie movie, which although may not look like a smart film, still has lots of brains. Let's check it out. Number 10. Toby Hooper was going to direct. Indeed, at one stage, legendary horror director Toby Hooper was attached to directing Return of the Living Dead, which frankly would have been awesome. But sadly, it wasn't meant to be. Also, the film was set to be filmed in 3D, cashing in on the 3D horror craze that had become a thing in the early 80s thanks to movies like Jaws 3D, Amityville 3D, and Friday the 13th 3D. But by the time Return of the Living Dead went into production, the gimmick had crashed and burned. But still, it is a shame that Toby Hooper didn't direct, as with movies like A Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Salem's Lot, it goes to show that he would have been awesome. But that said, Return of the Living Dead's eventual director Dan O'Bannon does an amazing job, so I guess it all worked out. Number 9, the extras ate real brains. Sometimes even movie extras have to perform undesirable and unpleasant tasks, and oh boy did the zombie extras have it hard in Return of the Living Dead, as in order to be authentic, they actually ate calf brains. They were, however, given a pay rise for being put through such gruesome fine dining. Well, hell yeah, if you're going to be making me eat brains, you better damn well give me a pay rise. And to prove that he wouldn't have his extras do anything that he wouldn't do himself, director Dan O'Bannon also ate calf brains in front of the extras, to prove that this film crew is one big brain-eating family. Also, Return of the Living Dead is the first piece of cinema fiction to introduce the notion of zombies eating brains. I mean, if you watch zombie movies before this, they just want to bite people, or just overall eat them, but not specifically the brain. And the whole gimmick of eating brains is something which even to this day is often used in zombie mythology. Number 8. The movie was a financial and critical success. Return of the Living Dead has the same ingredients as plenty of other horror movies that I've talked about in other episodes, in that it's a fun, carefree horror movie with plenty of 80s cheese to go round, which would suggest that it would become a cult classic over time. But in fact, that's not correct. It was a hit from the get-go. Even Roger Ebert liked it, who, as I explained in a previous episode, hated The Thing. So I just don't get how it works, but according to the philosophy of Ebert, The Thing equals bad and Return of the Living Dead equals good. What probably helped was the date that the movie was released, August the 16th, 1985, as also that day saw the release of American Flyers. Yeah, I remember that. The Bride, of course, and Year of the Dragon. Okay. No wonder the movie did so good. I mean, what even are these other movies? I mean, I'm an internet critic with no hair, and even I don't know what they are. Number 7. The producers wanted Romero to be attached. Seeing how Return of the Living Dead is something of a follow-up to Night of the Living Dead, the production team really wanted to have zombie master George A. Romero attached to the project as producer. Romero was the director of Night of the Living Dead and would go on to direct his own sequels to said movie. However, he didn't end up taking part in Return of the Living Dead purely because he never got back to the production company. And one Romero snub later, and Return of the Living Dead was a Romero-free production. Still, I wonder what the movie would have been like with Romero overlooking the production. Number 6, the man behind the puppet. One of the most memorable zombies in Return of the Living Dead was in fact the Tar Man, the putrefied, rotting zombie who wants nothing more than to eat some good brains. I guess what makes the character so memorable is his shocking presentation of gooey, rotting flesh. It's both horrific and fascinating. The character was brought to life via puppet work and having a performer in a suit. The Tar Man was performed by puppeteer Alan Troutman, and Return of the Living Dead was his first movie role. However, after Return of the Living Dead, he would go on to do puppet work for a completely different franchise, that of course being The Muppets, as he would do work for the Muppets Classic Theatre, Muppets from Space, the Muppets Wizard of Oz, as well as the TV show Muppets Tonight. And in addition to that, he also did puppetry work on the comedy sitcom Dinosaurs. So needless to say, Troutman came a long way with his career that started with the Tar Man and transpired to the domain of Kermit the Frog. Oh, and it's worth mentioning, he also did puppetry work on Return of the Living Dead Part 2, more on that later, and the Jack Frost movie, that one that starred Michael Keaton. Number 5, a little help from The Simpsons. So what do you do if you want your movie to have a funny and clever tagline? Why, you get the creator of The Simpsons to come up with one, of course. As Simpsons creator Matt Groening came up with Return of the Living Dead's memorable tagline, "They're back from the grave and ready to party." But in order to get this tagline, there was some trial and error. For example, one of the taglines that he created that wasn't used was, "They're hungry and they're not vegetarians." Well, I suppose it sums up the movie, as they are hungry and they are indeed not vegetarians. If I had to come up with a tagline, I would have said, "These zombies are hungry for brain food." But hey, that's crap, and that's why I don't invent taglines. Another failed tagline that Groening came up with was, "First they want to meet you, then they want to eat you." But the studio thought that was crap. Number 4, Dan O'Bannon was going to star in the movie. For those who don't know, Return of the Living Dead director Dan O'Bannon has had a pretty successful career. His biggest note to fame was writing the original classic Alien movie, along with Life Force, Aliens, and Total Recall. However, he also acts too, as he was going to play the character Frank, the old factory worker who wants to impress the new employee and accidentally causes the zombie crisis. When O'Bannon wrote the script, he wrote the character Frank with himself in mind for the role. But when James Karen turned up to audition for the role of another character in the movie, O'Bannon knew that he was the right guy to play Frank. And thus Karen got the role. And for those who don't know, Karen played Mr. Teague in Poltergeist, as in that guy who only moved the headstones! Man, in the 80s, that guy really liked messing around with dead people and causing supernatural disasters. Number 3, Return of the Living sequels. So naturally, because Return of the Living Dead was a hit, it was sequels ahoy. First up, there was Return of the Living Dead 2, which I swear the movie's poster just ripped off the Fright Night poster. Released in 1988, Part 2 continues the idea of zombies being part of a government experiment poisonous gas outbreak. And just like the first movie, it continues its trend of comedy horror and feels playful with plenty of thrills and spills. Also, both James Karen and Tom Matthews return but are in different roles, which is just confusing. Then in 1993 there was Return of the Living Dead 3, of which the movie's poster once again really fascinates me, as it doesn't really look like a zombie movie. The character on the poster to me looks more like a Mortal Kombat character. So in part 3, we have this character who dies, but gets brought back to life by the zombie gas, where she discovers that she can repress her zombie cravings through intense pain, which is why she keeps piercing herself with glass and shards of metal. It's an interesting and unique picture, but it should have been called something else and not have the Return of the Living Dead name attached to it. Then there was Return of the Living Dead 4 and Return of the Living Dead Rave to the Grave, both of which came out in 2005, but both felt like generic zombie movies, coming out in the wake of 28 Days Later, Shaun of the Dead, and the Dawn of the Dead remake, kind of cashing in on the new zombie craze, if you will. That, and they didn't have the fun, carefree, comical nature of the original movie. Number 2, two zombie movies going head to head. Yep, in 1985, movie audiences had two alternative follow-ups to Night of the Living Dead to choose from, as that year George A. Romero's third entry in his Dead series, Day of the Dead, came out. But despite the fact that the two movies featured zombies and have spawned from Night of the Living Dead, the two movies are actually worlds apart, as Return of the Living Dead took a more comical approach, whereas Day of the Dead was much more serious. Still, it must have been confusing for fans at the time, with two alternative sequels coming out at the same year, whilst being part of different franchises. In fact, one of Day of the Dead's producers got a little bit nervous about this ordeal and tried to get an injunction on the word Living Dead being used out of fear that people would think that it was part of Romero's Dead series. Number 1. Based on a book. Indeed, John Russo, who wrote the original Night of the Living Dead series, would go on to write a book called Return of the Living Dead, which acted as a follow-up to Night of the Living Dead. And during the 70s, Russo had tried to get Return of the Living Dead into development for it to be turned into a movie. This happened round about the same time George A. Romero went to work on his own Night of the Living Dead sequel, Dawn of the Dead. Russo owned the rights to the title Living Dead, which is why Romero couldn't call his movie Dawn of the Living Dead, but instead just Dead, along with the rest of his sequels. Sadly, Russo's true Night of the Living Dead sequel was never fully realised, as when the project did eventually get picked up, it was completely changed from Russo's original vision, making it a movie adaptation in name only. Now, I haven't read the book, but from research I've done, it's set 10 years after the events of Night of the Living Dead, where everything now seems to be back to normal. And just like the first movie, it's set in a small, quiet American town, where after a horrific bus crash, just like the first story, there is a sudden outburst of Living Dead zombies who are out to attack. The reviews on the book also seem to be polarizing. From reviews I've seen from people online, they seem to either love it or hate it. And incidentally, the book was written with the intention of starting a film series. Well guys, that was my look into Return of the Living Dead. One of the most enjoyable zombie movies ever. Because hey, even zombie movies don't always have to be dark and gloomy. They can also be fun and enjoyable. Anyway, I'm Minty, and brains!